we're very pleased to have Dr. Naomi Kikoler with us from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we're also very pleased to have Amy Cohen here, who will do the introduction. But forgive me for taking the mic for just a few minutes to do something that is very important to all of us. And if I may ask my fellow board members to join me here on stage, including and especially John. Please here on this side, if you don't mind. So as you all know, John Lifferton is the founder of Genocide Awareness Week, now in its 10th anniversary. And John, for some reasons that are completely beyond me, wants to retire. And he is passing the baton to us here at Arizona State University. We just want to recognize his dedication and commitment to genocide education in our state that has been so successful for 10 years, the enormous effort that he has put into it. And you all know John for exactly these efforts, but what you might not know about John is that he is an avid collector of medals and decorations. And ASU doesn't have medals, but we have something else to give him. And he is very fond of various kinds of fountain pens, and we have that too. So I'm very, very glad that Tua Samuelson is joining me, Tim McGill and Alex Alvarez, my fellow board members, to thank John Lifferton.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So this is not a medal. It's not a wedding ring either. No diamonds.
Oh, no, okay.
But I know you're fond of these things.
I am. That is very nice.
Recognize.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I know that Genocide Awareness Week is in excellent hands. I have nothing to worry about. This is going to grow. And I'll say a little bit after our discussion tonight, a little bit about a history, because we have a long partnership with the USHMM, and I'll mention some things, but this really means a lot to me. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yes.
I apologize for the delay. Amy, would you please introduce Naomi Kikoler?
Yes. My name is Amy Cohen, and it's an honor to introduce Dr. Naomi Kikoler, who I've had the pleasure of hearing several times through my involvement at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Naomi is the director of the Simon-Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. As the center's deputy director, she oversees the center's research, outreach, and policy engagement, and previously led as deputy director the center's policy work with the United States government on bearing witness countries, including undertaking the documentation of the commission of genocide by ISIS. Naomi has also previously developed and implemented the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, a coalition organized to save lives by mobilizing the international community to act in situations where populations are at risk of crimes against humanity. She worked on national security and refugee law and policy for Amnesty International Canada. Naomi has published widely, holds common law and civil law degrees from McGill University, a master's in forced migration from Oxford University, where her thesis was on the Rwandan genocide, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto in International Relations and Peace and Conflict Studies. Naomi is a member of the Canadian Center for the Responsibility to Protect, the Free Yazidi Foundation, and was called to the Bar of Upper Canada. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Naomi Kikoler.
Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you so much to Arizona State University for the wonderful opportunity to speak with each of you. I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I've had a very slow, fortunately, recovery from COVID, but I am glad that we're able to, in this virtual space, find a way to have this incredibly important and timely conversation. We're going to be talking about one of the most challenging mass atrocity situations facing the world today. And maybe just as a starting point, it's important to remind ourselves that as we participate in this event, each minute right now, Uyghur men, women, children are being persecuted on the basis of their identity. The Uyghurs are a Muslim community of close to 1 million people who live predominantly in Xinjiang, which is a province in northwest China. And they're a community that we at the Holocaust Museum are deeply concerned may be facing genocide and are currently experiencing crimes against humanity. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Uyghurs and their background before getting into some of the really challenging issues around the nature of the crimes that are happening to them. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority community that have long suffered severe human rights violations in Xinjiang, an area that the Uyghur community calls East Turkestan. There were two short-lived independent Uyghur republics in the 1930s and 1940s. And then in October of 1949, the People's Liberation Army moved into the region, creating the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is what the area is called today and falls under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. China has tried to forcibly assimilate the Uyghur community, seeking to turn them into those who resemble more the majority Han Chinese population. The process has included a very long history of violent incidences and crackdowns, including an uprising in 2009 in the capital that killed hundreds. The repression of the Uyghurs is something that we became extremely concerned of in the past decade. It reached new levels when in 2016, Shen Zhuangju became the party secretary of Xinjiang. He had been responsible for developing and implementing the repressive strategies that were put into place in neighboring Tibet. This included mass arrests and mass detention camps, and also new electronic surveillance. Since 2017, these violations have escalated. So what does it look like for the Uyghur community today? The Uyghur community today, what we've seen is the intentional destruction of cultural and religious sites, restrictions on religious and cultural observance for the Uyghur community, an incredibly sophisticated high-tech surveillance that tracks their movements. In some areas of the province, that literally means every few hundred meters, there is something that is tracking them. It could be visual facial recognition or other forms of technological surveillance embedded in their cell phones or in other devices that they have, tracking where they're going, who they're talking to, what they're doing. But the surveillance also takes on a different form, includes even the placing of party officials and others, Han Chinese, into Uyghur families, so that you are being monitored literally on a daily basis when you are together in your private home. Part of the goal there is to try to essentially create a pipeline for detention, to identify individuals who are doing things like wearing traditional clothing, praying. Those are all grounds for people to be detained. And we believe that between 1 to 3 million Uyghurs have been detained over the past few years. And those are the numbers that the US government has been using and relying on. The cause and reason for the detention, as I said, could be as simple as simply praying. Of course, from the perspective of the Chinese government, they assert that they're individuals who pose a terrorist threat, a threat for secessionism, for asserting independence. But we've seen many of the now leaked documents that show the reasons for why people were originally arrested and detained. And as I noted, it's something in many cases as innocuous as merely wearing your own traditional clothing or carrying out a religious observance. One of the things that's been particularly troubling has been the high rates of forced sterilization and the implantations of IUDs into Uyghur women. So when we think about what that means in a broader context, and we think about the commission of mass atrocities, as a center, we are a center dedicated to trying to essentially do for communities today what was not done for the Jews of Europe. We undertake research trying to understand the causes and consequences of genocide, trying to identify policy options in situations where we think that crimes are at risk, undertaking early warning work to raise alarm bells, but also documenting crimes when we believe they have occurred. In November of 2021, we released a detailed report that sought to, through careful research and rigorous legal analysis of publicly available information, outline how the Chinese government's conduct had escalated beyond a policy of forced assimilation over recent years into something that we think is far more alarming and sinister. This includes, in particular, a deepening assault of Uyghur female reproductive capacity through forced sterilization and, as I mentioned, the forced IUD placement, but also the separation of sexes through mass detention and forcible transfer. We're gravely concerned, based on that the Chinese government may be committing genocide against the Uyghurs. The government is failing in its obligation to prevent genocide, that's quite clear. And the seriousness of the attack on the Uyghur population really does demand the immediate response of the international community to protect the victims. This report builds on earlier research that we did where we outlined the legal rationale to state that there was a reasonable basis to believe that the Chinese Communist Party had perpetrated crimes against humanity, notably of persecution and imprisonment, as well as other severe deprivation of physical liberty against the Uyghurs. The most recent report that we put out further advanced our analysis of crimes against humanity and added on forced sterilization, sexual violence, enslavement, torture, and forcible transfer. Now, one thing that's important to note is normally when we do this type of work, we seek to travel to the country where the crimes are occurring or to neighboring countries to interview people. In this case, that was impossible to do for security reasons and because it's simply impossible to access Uyghurs who are being detained in Xinjiang or safely interview people who have fled to neighboring countries without imperiling themselves and their families. As many of you know, Uyghurs who speak out, including in the United States, are targeted. And many of our partners are individuals who tragically, in the course of speaking out about their loved ones, came to learn that additional family members were imprisoned as a result of them expressing concerns and speaking out. So it's a very, very difficult and tragic situation for those within the Uyghur community who are trying to counter the narrative of the Chinese government and also shed light on what is happening to these communities. For us, genocide and crimes against humanity are amongst the gravest crimes known to humankind, and the punishment of those crimes formed part of the world's commitment to never again after the Holocaust. It's important just to always remember that both genocide and crimes against humanity were prosecuted at Nuremberg, and the majority of the cases prosecuted were actually crimes against humanity. So we tend to focus quite a lot on this question of genocide, but crimes against humanity and their commission are incredibly dire and should in and of themselves merit and elicit the same level of international alarm and response as when we see genocide occur. One of the things that makes this particular situation a bit unique, and I'll just take a moment just to talk a little bit about almost the gendered nature of our understanding of genocide, is that this is a genocide where it largely rests on the biological destruction of a people. When we think of genocide, we tend to think of the Holocaust. We tend to think of the very kind of emblematic cases. Today is tragically the 28th anniversary of the start of the Rwandan genocide, one where we all remember the very vivid images that were shown around the world of bodies floating down the river, of really tragic and horrific sights. things that were reminiscent of the aftermath of the Holocaust and the images of just the horror that was carried out there. In the context of Xinjiang, we're not talking about a situation where there is mass killing being undertaken. What we're talking about is the fact that the Genocide Convention carries within it a number of different acts, including acts that are intended to restrict the future births or the ability of a community to reproduce. And that is really where the crux of the argument around genocide in the context of Xinjiang rests. One of the things that's important to kind of remind ourselves when we look at the case of Xinjiang is that when we think of genocide, all too often women and girls have not had the requisite attention paid towards them as victims of genocide. And our report serves as a reminder to that. It's important because women are often the focus of the actions of genocidal perpetrators. Specific strategies are developed to target them. And this often falls into the category of acts that are not solely mass killing. They're acts of sexual violence, attacks on their reproductive capacity, either through rape or forced pregnancies with the aim of bearing children who don't share the same identity, as we saw, for example, in the Yazidi community with the genocide perpetrated by ISIS, or, as in this case, through actions intended to restrict birth, all undertaken with an intent to destroy the community. What we've seen here with this deepening assault on the Uyghur reproductive capacity, based on leaked information, suggests that already hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs may not have been born as a result of both the forced sterilization and the forced IUD placement, but also as a result of the separation of the sexes through mass detention and forcible transfer. You have men and women of childbearing age who are separated from each other and put into detention, often at times for years. You have married couples that are separated. You also have individuals that are being forcibly transferred to different parts of the province, different parts of China, which inhibits their ability to, again, reproduce and bear Uyghur children. On the forcible transfer area, that crime is linked very much to the crime of forced labor. And this is why there's been such an emphasis in some of the legislation coming out of Congress on targeting forced labor coming from China, because unfortunately there are strong grounds to believe that Uyghurs are being used in the production of a lot of things that we're using, from the cotton that's in the t-shirts we wear to products that are in our electronic devices. When we think again about just the Holocaust, what we often forget is some of the earliest crimes of the Holocaust was actually the forced sterilization of women deemed to be undesirable due to their race or religion. And when we think also about sexual violence, it took decades for survivors and researchers to raise these crimes, often due to societal stigma and trauma. And they were actually not included in the prosecutions at Nuremberg. Thankfully, in the past few decades, there's been a growing understanding that women and girls face unique threats and had their own distinct protection needs. And that's been particularly acute in the last few years when we think about the Yazidi community and now today with the Uyghur community, though each case, of course, has manifested itself in different ways. Now, when we think about the notion that China may be committing genocide, it's really important to grapple with the reality that this is one of the world's superpowers, and that the impunity with which the Chinese government has been able to commit these crimes thus far cannot continue to persist. The future of a people may depend on swift, global, and coordinated action. It's interesting to say that in the wake of what is transpiring in Ukraine, there might be some additional hope for the Uyghur community. I've been speaking with many of our Uyghur partners about the shock that they have had to a degree over almost the difference in response to the crimes that have been perpetrated against their families and their own community and what's unfolding in Ukraine. Many have raised the Olympics and how there was an effort to try to encourage corporate actors to not sponsor the Olympics, to discourage people from attending the Olympics, to discourage governments from supporting or from even participating. And many have remarked, wow, look at how quickly now Russia has been banned from most international sporting events. The corporate sector has very much engaged, and you see many businesses pulling out of Russia at this particular time. So it's given members of the Uyghur community a moment of hope that perhaps a similar mobilization may be possible in their own case. But we know that we face a lot of challenges. The Chinese government is continuing to go to extreme lengths to hide the true nature of the crimes that they are committing. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is expected to travel to China to go to Xinjiang. For many, that is very alarming because there is a very serious concern that what she will be shown is not the true nature of the crimes that are occurring. It'll rather be more a tour of a kind of Potemkin village. Our hope is that if the trip is undertaken, every effort will be made to try beforehand to secure certain outcomes before even undertaking the trip, such as the release of large numbers of Uyghurs who are being detained, changes in various policies. The Chinese government really has gone to exemplary efforts in trying to deny and restrict access to the vast network of detention centers and prisons and to the millions of people's lives who they are persecuting. But the reality is that considerable information has gotten out, and we really can't say that we did not know that these crimes were occurring in real time. The information that's available is damning. It should prompt swift and coordinated global action to halt and prevent these crimes. We haven't seen much change in the actions of the Chinese government, both in the aftermath of the release of this report, the announcement by the US government of a finding of genocide against the Chinese Communist Party, or in the aftermath of a somewhat muted outcry around the Olympics. One thing that we did see was after a 5-year reign, the party secretary for Xinjiang that I mentioned before, Chen, was replaced in late 2021. It's unclear whether or not this has any significance, if that was as a result of pressure placed on the Chinese government or a sense that they needed for cosmetic reasons to make certain changes. But we've seen no indication that there's been a change in the security policies in Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghur community. So maybe just as I turn very briefly on what we need to do, as an institution, it's important, and we try to underscore this at all times, we understand intimately that those who perpetrate the crimes wreak profound harm on the immediate victims and communities and set in motion trauma that can cascade through multiple generations. The Chinese government's actions have sought to eliminate the culture and soul of the Uyghur community. And today we fear that they are trying to eliminate them as a people. As I mentioned, we're especially concerned about the crimes committed against women, a community that are all too often forgotten throughout history. And what is urgently needed is for the Chinese government to immediately halt the commission of crimes against the Uyghurs. To do that, we really do need to ensure that there is a coordinated global response. And given the scale of the crimes and the unique challenges posed by China as a perpetrator, that makes it all the more critical. One of the things that we have been urging for in terms of what needs to be done is the unfettered access by independent monitors to Xinjiang. And I already shared our concerns that we have about the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights' visit. But we also want to make sure that there are increased deterrents placed against various actors, such as additional sanctions, import restrictions, ensuring that businesses are not relying on the use of forced labor, also ensuring that businesses, American businesses, are not engaged in the production or development of technologies that have dual use purposes to them. Things, for example, like technology that was used to advance facial recognition so that we can, for example, walk into a fast food restaurant and pay by just having our retina and face scanned, in the context of Xinjiang, have very, very dangerous implications because they're being used to monitor and track a particular community, target and persecute them. And we also need to work on making sure that we provide protection for Uyghur communities who have fled China. That includes both the provision of asylum and refugee status in countries where they flee to, but also protection from their ability to speak out. As I mentioned before, many have been the targets of threats. Many have seen retaliation against them for speaking out and for being critical of the Chinese government. And we should ensure that those, if they are individuals within the United States who are doing that and who are intimidating members of the Uyghur community, that they are held accountable for their actions as well. Another area that we've been focused on is trying to ensure that there are appropriate resources dedicated to the collection and the analysis of information about the ongoing atrocity crimes and the risk of future mass atrocities, including critically information about changes in birth rates. This is very important given what I noted before about how we believe that this genocide may be being perpetrated. And we have to be very creative when we think about the mechanisms that can be used to help advance efforts around accountability. As I said before, and mindful of what's happening in Ukraine, it's been remarkable to see how within a little over a month, we've seen the creation of a commission of inquiry at the Human Rights Council. We've seen the UN General Assembly speak out and condemn Russia's actions. We've seen a slew of sanctions placed and various actions taken by an array of actors. For the Uyghur community, they're hoping that similar steps will be taken to help protect them. And I think that we just need to be mindful, though we cannot see what is happening within detention centers, and though we tend to think of genocide, again, as I said before, as mass killings, we need to know that unfortunately, what is unfolding in China today is the modern face of what the future of mass atrocity crimes, be it genocide and crimes against humanity, look like. And the Chinese government poses not just a threat to the Uyghur community, but through their exporting of these repressive technologies, through the sharing of technologies to surveil communities, they pose a threat to communities around the world as they share ways in which one can, should they choose to commit these crimes, do so essentially without the eyes of the international community on them. So with that, I'll just end and open it up to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I have a question, and does anyone really think that Xi Jinping actually cares what the world thinks?
It's a really great question. I think that's been one of the most challenging issues for all of us who've been working on crimes being perpetrated by the Chinese government. We have yet to truly find strong indications of changes in behavior. And when you're trying to think about the policy tools that are available to mitigate the risk of mass atrocities or to halt them when they're occurring, you look for indication that there is behavioral change. What we've actually seen is a increase in the level of securitization at some of the detention facilities and the changes in some of the detention facilities. We have not seen anything that looks like it could be mass releases or significant lifting of some of the repressive policies. In recent weeks, with the talk of the UN High Commissioner's visit, reportedly within the capital of Xinjiang, there has been some more freedom of movement without the same level of surveillance, but those are very, very kind of small changes, and whether or not they're durable and lasting is I think, very, very questionable. So, you know, I think the only avenue for which many have felt that there has been any real pain potentially that could be inflicted, and pain's not the right term, but could change behavior, has really been through kind of various economic means. And there we've seen, and it would suggest that the Chinese government and Xi Jinping is nervous about this. There we have seen pushback against corporations who have expressed concerns about doing business in Xinjiang. We've seen the Chinese government mobilize the public to come out and protest in front of businesses in major Chinese cities if those businesses have said anything publicly about Xinjiang or have suggested that they might pull out of Xinjiang. So there's some indication that actions in kind of that will have economic implications are on his mind, and that they are doing everything they can to counter that. But I think we have unfortunately found ourselves with a perpetrator who has, in a very deft way, managed to, through placing key officials in senior positions within the UN, within other multilateral institutions, through investments, not just in the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now, expanding throughout Asia and Africa and into Europe. We've really seen the Chinese government, from a financial perspective, been able to persuade and co-opt a lot of governments to continue to support them, despite the nature of the crimes that are occurring. So your question is an incredibly important one, and it's an incredibly difficult one, especially given the dire conditions in which the Uyghur community finds themselves today.
Your comment about economics perfectly leads into my question. So as many companies are moving into China, particularly some of the more noble ones being Disney, the sports companies like the Major League Basketball and Nike, have there been any effective means, either culturally or legally, to challenge their expansion into China?
It's a really great question. And what's fascinating is, some of these corporations are very concerned about, not the ones that you named, some of the corporations that do more work in the technology space, or who are in extractives, or even, for example, the cotton industry. They're very concerned about questions, especially when you raise the language of genocide, on whether or not one could make an argument that they could potentially have been enabling the commission of these crimes. And part of the reasons that they might be concerned is they could very well be doing business with an entity. Many large Chinese businesses are actually government owned or have large kind of government stake holders. And so there are some questions that can be raised about questions of enabling and complicity. And that is an interesting question, even just in a US legal context. If you have not just Chinese government officials traveling to the United States, but even business leaders and others who may be implicated, could there perhaps now, after there's been a finding of genocide by the US government, be any legal ramifications to them? That raises one question. Does that serve as a deterrent to doing business in China? Potentially for some. But likely not for many, because it also would be quite rare that this could be invoked or be applicable in that case. But many companies are asking these questions. A lot of companies are asking about the reputational concerns associated with doing business in a country where these crimes are believed to be occurring. Now, that only really begins to take hold if there is enough of a large public outcry. And I think the verdict's a little bit out around the Olympics. I used the term muted. I don't think we saw the level of response that perhaps some were hoping for in terms of public concern about what was happening. And that hasn't necessarily translated into large conversations about whether or not consumers are comfortable using products that were perhaps produced by forced labor or produced in China in general. So that, again, there's some questions there. But there are many conversations that are underway about how the business sector can work together in a more coordinated manner to engage on human rights issues in China. That includes Xinjiang, but it also includes freedom of expression. It includes what's happening in Hong Kong, and a number of different actions that do pose a lot of problems for businesses. The climate has also changed. There are, as we saw, for example, with the detention of 2 Canadians and the implications there for members of the business sector. When we talk to people, there is a concern, even just around the safety and security of some of their staff who are working in China. So I think there's a change afoot. And again, it'll be very interesting to see whether or not the Ukraine and the response to Ukraine creates a new set of expectations. And many of those, companies are also doing business in China. So it really, I think a lot of it will come up down to what public mobilization looks like, and what advocacy campaigns are undertaken to try to ensure that there is equity to a certain degree in the response. I will say, some of my Uyghur colleagues, as with my Syrian colleagues and Rohingya colleagues, are quite pointed and say, why is it that there is a strong response in Ukraine, yet when the victims are Muslim or not white, we don't see the same level of urgency and the same response, not just from the international community, but also from the private sector. I think those are very merited and very important conversations that need to be happening. The response to the Ukraine, it needs to be strong. That type of response is what we need to see across the board for communities facing these types of crimes. I think there's some questions in the chat too.
Yes, and for the online folks, please put your questions in the Q&A. That would be helpful. Thank you. So the question online is, why would you think governments would act forcibly against Xinjiang, as with Ukraine? Europeans are worried about their security. Who's threatened enough? Got to scroll down here. Second. Okay, who's threatened enough to act in the way NATO is today with Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think that many of us who follow China closely would argue that the level of the threat posed by China is incredibly grave. The threat that they pose to the international order in terms of undermining a rule-based system is the same. Their actions may look different than what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, but their intentions are exactly the same. They use different strategies, and they use different strategies to repress. The outcomes are incredibly dire. And as I mentioned before, China, through especially its economic relationships and through the ability to really kind of co-opt at this point entire regions of the world into their sphere of influence and ensure that there is no expressions of condemnation or concern for their actions, really creates a very, very dangerous dynamic. They have been helping to support repressive governments, and I mentioned before, helping both from an economic perspective, but also helping in terms of the sharing of technologies and tactics that are used to repress. So for many of us who are concerned about kind of human rights, rule of law, China poses a very large existential threat to the worldview that we are trying to preserve, and one that was really kind of born out of the Holocaust. The Chinese have been seeking to put forward, an example that they're responsible leaders, contributing to UN peacekeeping, being engaged on a number of different issues in development assistance, for example. But it comes at all times with strings attached, and in a way that is detrimental in the long term to human rights, not just within China, but throughout the world. So it's really, I think, quite an existential question that we need to grapple with. Again, the tactics and the strategies are different. They are not as Putin is right now, actively bombing cities. Their way of doing it is far more subtle, but the consequences, for example, for the Uyghur community is just as devastating. So I personally am of the opinion that in the long term, their efforts to undermine a rule-based system is just as significant and grave as that of Russia, but it is harder to see, just as the crimes they're committing against the Uyghurs are harder to decipher, but just as real, and merit just as much of a response. But the challenge that we have, and we see even in the context of the Ukraine, the challenges around some of the sanctions involving oil our interconnectedness and our reliance on China is even much more greater than that is in the context of Russia. Their economy is far greater. So it poses many more challenges to being able to actually employ some of the range of tools and the same level of creativity, or build the same political will to get, for example, a commission of inquiry created for Xinjiang. We simply can't. When an issue like Xinjiang is brought up before the UN Human Rights Council, it is impossible to actually advance the issue in a constructive way. The same goes within the General Assembly. There's simply no ability to have a conversation about what is happening within China, because too many countries are indebted to the Chinese today.
Thank you for that. We have another online question, and I do see some hands up. Please do as Bill Simmons did and pop those questions in the Q&A. And our question is from Bill Simmons. Thank you, Naomi. I do some work for the Kyrgyzstan in Kyrgyzstan, which has a small Uyghur population, and it has been assumed that some Uyghurs are fleeing across the border from Xinjiang. But the Kyrgyz government is very deferential to the Chinese government because of the various trade initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. Would it be possible to provide any assurances to countries like Kyrgyzstan to give more support to Uyghurs to help publicize what's going on? Is anyone working with these countries on this?
Oh, it's a really good question. As I mentioned before, one of the major challenges that we have had with some of the research that we've undertaken is that we determined that it was not safe to travel to some of the countries in the region that have taken in Uyghurs, or Uyghurs have fled because of security concerns. One of the concerns that exists, and I don't believe, and I could be wrong, but I don't believe that this has been an issue in regards to Kyrgyzstan, but it has when it comes to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan too, is around people being sent back to China. Which really makes it very hard for Uyghurs to, as you suggest, kind of speak out or publicize the nature of the crimes that are occurring. Many people working on these issues feel that there have been a number of missed opportunities to, as you say, provide assurances to some of the countries, some of the stans that are taking people in, or Turkey, and also to be creative around the diplomacy to kind of help create some gaps. Especially as you noted around kind of the Belt and Road Initiative and a number of other economic relationships that exist largely through kind of various development efforts. The response to COVID is one example. The Chinese were quite quick to go and provide to a number of countries around the world their vaccine. And a number of people have felt that that has been an area where perhaps even on issues like this, there could have been a more coordinated response from like-minded countries to provide alternative vaccines to some of these kind of neighboring areas as a way of perhaps giving in a different form the type of assurance that you're talking about. So I think it is an important area. It's one that is, discussed at least within policy circles. But as of yet, there hasn't been many kind of successful advances made in that regard. And as a result, for many who have fled, the situation that they face is really quite precarious.
What has been the diplomatic response from Muslim majority nations, particularly those amongst the Belt and Road and into Africa?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There hasn't, unfortunately, been much of one. There was an effort to engage the OIC. There was, I'm blanking now, and I apologize on what the timing was. Maybe 2 years ago, kind of a statement or expression of concern, which very quickly was kind of not retracted, but never again kind of mentioned. So as a formal block, there's been virtually none. Individual countries, we have yet to see an individual country step up, like the Gambia, for example, did in the context of the Rohingya. For those who aren't familiar, in the aftermath of the 2017 attacks on the Rohingya community in Burma, which we and others in the US government has recently kind of determined constituted genocide. The Gambia went forward to bring a case before the International Court of Justice, basically raising the question of whether or not genocide was committed in the application of the Genocide Convention to Burma. Really significant and very important that it was the Gambia and an OIC state that took that forward. Unfortunately, not many countries have joined their effort, which is a real tragedy. But we haven't seen anything like that done in the Uyghur context. We have not seen it doesn't matter if it's a Muslim state or any state really step up and be a voice. Now, the United States has been quite outspoken, started primarily kind of under the Trump administration, has continued now into this administration, but that has failed to muster really a strong kind of international or coordinated voice. And arguably, I think because of just the way the dynamic is perceived, the US is not necessarily the best voice to be raised and trying to foster that international coalition that's needed to think of creative responses, because so much of this gets reduced down into a US versus China economic war, US versus China new kind of Cold War perceptions. It gets, kind of perceived by many as being not about human rights and actually about other issues. So our hope really is that other countries choose to pick up this issue and really be advocates and try to find a creative grouping of countries that are representative of each of the continents to stand up and speak out. And again, many people would have said if we went back 2 months ago that you would never see Russia kicked out of the Human Rights Council. You never would have seen a human commission of inquiry created. You would never, all of these things that simply would never have been possible in the context of Russia. Again, China is a more formidable opponent from my perspective for a number of reasons, but I do think it does give some hope for communities that are being targeted by the Chinese government, that maybe if we can test some of our assumptions, something might be possible. And at a bare minimum, really even just pushing for access to detention centers, to information being provided to families on the location and the condition of their loved ones. I mean, the idea that people do not know and have not heard from their loved ones for months and years, it is so incredibly painful. So there are some, I think, things that hopefully could be achieved. But at this point, to your question, neither from that kind of grouping nor really from anywhere have we seen strong championing of the Uyghur cause.
Thank you. I have a bit of a double-pronged question, if that's all right. So one, given the kind of concealed nature of these crimes and the challenges to revealing them, what has the process been like for, uncovering evidence and, who have been the major parties in that? And then secondarily, obviously denial is something we pretty much always see with genocide. How is that going? Are there any particular kind of challenges with denial or particular rhetoric around that in this situation?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. And I'm going to quickly just write them down because one of the COVID brain issues is I tend to forget. So I'm just going to quickly write them down. Challenges. First one was challenges. The second one, sorry, was denial.
Sorry, yeah, the first challenges in gathering evidence and the major parties shedding light on it, and then the second about denial.
Okay, thanks, and I apologize.
Of course, thank you so much.
No. So the maybe just starting on the denial part. It was very interesting when we released our report. The official response from the Chinese government was that we were wrong, distorting information, and China is a tolerant country in which communities live together without any problems. That was to be expected, and it's a common refrain. And it's also the image and narrative that they tried to espouse in the course of the Olympics, and that they hired firms, including American firms, to try to help propagate and advance. Where denial becomes very hard and very challenging and also very painful for many of our Uyghur partners is the common refrain of the Chinese Communist Party has been that the Uyghur community pose essentially two major threats. They pose a threat of terrorism, and that they pose a threat of essentially secessionism, desire to seek an independent region. And the invocation of the language of terror is one that is incredibly persuasive and has been persuasive in the past, and is particularly dangerous. It's one of the reasons why we've seen just mass detention. I mean, to think that 1 to 3 million people have been put into detention is really hard to even begin to fathom. And that's why it's really important, I think, for all of us, all of you, governments to consistently be talking about the civilian nature of who is being targeted, to give the Uyghur community and preserve the Uyghur community's human dignity, because at various points in time, there were small numbers of Uyghurs, for example, who did go to Afghanistan in the 70s and fight, who have been present there still. And anytime that there's any suggestion, for example, that a Uyghur has been involved in an attack in Afghanistan, China uses that to reassert its argument that the Uyghur community in its entirety poses a threat because they are essentially terrorists. So I think we have to be very, very vigilant in pushing back against that narrative, and very, very careful to help. And one of the things that we do is share the individual stories. I mean, Jews during the Holocaust were also perceived as posing various threats. Share stories, help humanize the situation. One of our colleagues that we work with, her brother she talks about her brother who was a tech entrepreneur. What was his crime? His crime was he was invited by the State Department to come to the United States on an official visit and participate in a program that they did, went back to China and was arrested and has been in detention for years now. She talks about him. She talks about, what he was like as a person. That helps to counter some of the denial. I think it's becoming increasingly harder, and this goes to the first part of your questions, for the Chinese to continue to keep up the narrative that they have. And we have seen some changes in how they explain what they're doing. At first, it was kind of outright denial. Then it became re-education camps and acknowledgement that people, were being put into some forms of re-education. And the reason it's becoming harder is because there is information that's getting out. And the information is coming from a number of different sources. One of the things that's really quite interesting and telling is there has been quite a lot of leaked data, leaked information, many records that show, for example, detention papers, why people were arrested and what the process was for them to be going into detention. So there's been mass leaks of government documents as well that outline the justification and the rationale for why they are doing the policies that they're doing in Xinjiang. There's also been individuals who've come forward and spoken about what they saw and the role that they played. So, for example, there was a Chinese security official who spoke to CNN about what he did and what he saw. That was just prior to the Olympics. That all helps to corroborate the statements and the testimonies that come from the individuals who've been released from detention. And they form a large body of a lot of the material that, along with the leaked documents and the other data that's been released, that has helped organizations like ourselves, the US government and others, do an analysis of the nature of the crimes. There's also information, and this is information that sometimes is harder to kind of just confirm the veracity of, but information about birth rates, for example, that are published and that have been published by various Chinese provinces at different times. A lot of statements that have been made public by Chinese government officials explaining the rationale behind their use of IUDs or forced sterilization, but also notably in the context of the Uyghurs, the increase in forced sterilization and forced IUD implantations as it pertains to the Uyghurs has occurred at the same time as a overall reduction in the use of sterilization and IUDs in other parts of China with other populations. And there's quite a lot of just statements on the public record from Chinese government officials talking about that and talking also about demographic issues. So there are a number of different sources where information has come. Some that's kind of creative just of recently has been, and some of you might have seen this because it went viral. There was a young Han man who, kept hearing these reports. People in China have access to VPN. They can get at times access to information coming from beyond the firewall about what is happening in China, and that had been hearing these reports of potential detention centers. So he put a drone up, and what do you know? He, through using the drone, finds a detention center that went viral. Satellite imagery is another source of information. Now, where some of the challenges come is just in, again, and this is difficult in every single situation, corroborating, triangulating kind of the information. But there is enough out there that we feel confident in our finding and our analysis. And clearly the US government and others have as well. Where it becomes difficult is, again, as I mentioned before, and as we think today, this is not always true, and unfortunately, it usually means that action is mobilized after the fact, especially as we think about the anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. But people tend to act, governments tend to become mobilized when there is images that are evocative and provocative. And we see that also with Buka and what has transpired just recently. We saw in the case of Sarajevo, and you'll hear it talked about now, even as they talk about what's happening in the Ukraine, the bombing of Sarajevo bread lines. There are these moments in time where political will has been galvanized, in part by the existence of very vivid imagery showing the true nature and the true horrors of atrocity crimes. We simply will not have that in the context of the Uyghurs. And when you talk about challenges are of being believed when you can't show something that people can't see. And I'm always reminded of the experience that Jan Karski had when Jan Karski came to the United States after having gone into ghettos and having learned about the horrors of what was happening also in concentration camps. And he met with Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter and told him what he had seen and what he had heard. And of course, he had some drawings and he had his own firsthand accounts. And Felix Frankfurter, said, I simply can't believe you. It's not that I don't believe you, I can't bring myself to believe you. The power of an image, and of course we know images can be doctored, but the power of an image to convey something it still remains incredibly catalytic in the world of kind of genocide prevention and mass atrocity prevention. Again, it usually is action taken too late in the aftermath of crimes that have already occurred. But in this particular context, I would say there are challenges when it comes to documentation because we can't get access to detention facilities. It's hard to do this work in neighboring countries. There are organizations that are doing that. There are immense risks to all involved as a result. But the challenge really is in being able to capture the political attention and sustain the political attention when genocide may be perpetrated in a way that people don't understand, and when people can't see the consequences and the ramifications. And you could try to tell stories with the Olympics. We can say, think of all of the future Olympians that just never will be born. within the Jewish community, and at the museum, we often say that there, is a lost generation. You simply do not know what would have been possible from the millions of people that never had a chance to live and the millions of people who never had a chance to be born. And so we try to explain that in the context of the Uyghur community, but it's challenging. So I'd say there's a couple of different challenges that come around documentation and also just how you compel action and political will.
Hi, my name is Delraba. I am first year educational policy and evaluation student. I'm Uyghur from Kazakhstan, and this topic is really personal and emotional for me. Thank you for telling and being brave, because us as a researchers, it's really hard to even connect with other Uyghur refugees, because as you said, personal stories, like testimonies are very important, but few people say, but most Uyghurs, they're afraid to be caught because there are a lot of spies, as they say. So thank you very much for this. It's not question because you covered everything. More like what steps maybe human rights organizations or the government should take to protect Uyghur researchers and Uyghur refugees and have academic freedom.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you raising this, and I really appreciate you just speaking in general, because I know that it is incredibly difficult to do so. And I, my immense sympathy to you and to your loved ones in your community. I think for everyone who's sitting in the room and watching, I mean, even just the fact that you stood up to speak is something that does put you at risk, and it's a tragic reality that is the situation that is facing the Uyghur community. As you've alluded to, it's especially true when it comes to campuses, unfortunately, where there are a lot of people who, especially if there's a talk that is given on Uyghur issues or on issues pertaining to Hong Kong, there are people who monitor, the discussions, who's speaking, what questions are being asked. There is a lot of harassment of members of the Uyghur community and Uyghur advocates living in the United States, Canada, Germany, and elsewhere. So some of the recommendations that we put forward that I mentioned before include, providing temporary protected status, providing refugee and asylum to Uyghurs who are outside of China. Really making sure that there is police and other kind of monitoring of individuals who are doing the harassing of individuals who are undertaking research. That's something that is very much just kind of within the prerogative of security in the United States that can be achieved. And I don't think enough is being done right now, especially to create safe spaces on campuses for people to talk about these particular issues. And then, just in general, I think as much as possible, human rights organizations creating environments where you feel comfortable speaking and others feel comfortable speaking is incredibly important. So, I applaud ASU for doing that and for raising these particular issues. In some places, when there have been talks on Uyghurs, there are protests, or the talk is the university receives pressure and is encouraged to not actually hold the event. That's the level of just kind of engagement and attempt to kind of coerce that exists. And it does become very, very difficult for people like yourself to be able to then raise their voice. Again, I would say the biggest challenge that many of our Uyghur colleagues face when speaking out is the unfortunate reality that if they speak at an event in Tempe or in San Francisco, there is a high chance that their family member living somewhere in Xinjiang will be interviewed, detained, and could very well go missing. And that is, really something that is incredibly painful to recognize. And it's why I think many organizations try to go to great lengths to protect Uyghur partners and colleagues who are sharing their experiences. But I just have an immense amount of immense amount of respect for the Uyghur partners that we work with, because they undertake the work with a lot of threats to themselves. I just saw a question in regards to myself going to China. We and many people who work on China do, for security reasons, kind of evaluate what that means in terms of safety from a travel perspective, and also in terms of our digital safety and security as an institution. And I think every human rights organization, any institution that's done work on China, has to also just be very careful and vigilant around their digital security, because there are attempts at all times to infiltrate your devices. And yes, it's not safe to travel in some instances if you've been outspoken on these issues. So the only thing I will say is any threat that we experience, or any threat that I might ever face, is nothing in comparison to what Delrab or others from within the Uyghur community face. So as much as we can all stand in solidarity and create some sense of strength, I think is incredibly important. And I'll just maybe just on that one quick thread, because it's a bit of a through line back to the question around the corporate sector. The strength of one business choosing to speak out or pull out of Xinjiang is not great. But if they work in coordination and cooperation with each other, we have seen examples where coalitions of businesses can affect positive change from a human rights perspective. But they have to take that step to start working together. And that's been one of our major messages to those working in the corporate sector. Your strength is greater if you work together and in solidarity with each other. And because we believe that the private sector has such a critical role to play in changing the perhaps behavior of the Chinese government, we hope that we'll start to see that going forward. So just wanted to note that strength in numbers applies in a number of different ways.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi. Let's give a round of applause to Naomi for her wonderful. And I know it's been a long night for you under the circumstances of convalescing from COVID and such. One mission of the USHMM is to mitigate and try to prevent future genocides, and your work and that of the Simon-Skjodt Center is certainly more important than ever in what you're doing to ensure that never forget and hopefully never again is not a shallow promise. If you wonder what you can do on an individual level, you can also boycott Chinese products. I know when I have to go online and order things, I really do try to find out whether or not the product was made in the PRC. And if it was, I don't buy it. And that could be anything from a fountain pen to a guitar. Lots of guitar companies, American guitar companies, have products made in China, and I just refuse to buy those. And it's it may not do, it may not do much, but maybe it does. I tell everybody that, and it's their choice. As all of you are aware, this is the 10th anniversary of Genocide Awareness Week. And as such, it's also the anniversary of our continuing partnership with the USHMM. Our working together goes back 11 years, as the first year was an educator's workshop. And over the last 11 years, GAW has had 6 USHMM speakers, 7 with tonight. Others such as Steve Luckert, who wrote The State of Deception, The Power of Nazi Propaganda, Carl Wilkins, who stayed behind in Rwanda in order to save lives, and which because of him, there are literally thousands of people alive. And Clementine Wamaria, a Rwandan who wrote The Girl Who Smiled Beads. And I would profusely like to make some thank yous this evening. One to Amy Cohen, who's not only a friend, but also the fund chair for USHMM, and Marla Abram, the director of the Western region for the museum, and for their generous and constant support, as well as their organizational skills, which have helped and ensured that GAW grew from a one-day workshop into the week-long conference that is the largest in North America. And those are the USHMM's words. They're not my words. So as mentioned, GAW started as a Saturday educators workshop in June in Arizona when it was hot and schools weren't in session, but 130 teachers attended, and it was a great success. So I asked Dr. Gaylor, the then president of Scottsdale Community College, if we could do one the following April, Genocide Awareness Month, due to the Rwandan genocide, as Naomi previously mentioned. I thought a little mini conference would be fine. And Dr. Gaylor, the great educator that she is, said, yes, go with it, take it. So I started working on it. And as I approached speakers and organizations, I could see that GAW could be much larger. And it grew into a 6-day-long conference with a workshop for educators at the end. And the Jewish and Armenian communities were exceptionally supportive. They brought in the Assyrian and Bosnian communities and all 3 state universities. So we had international speakers, authors, film producers, politicians, law enforcement and human rights activists, and they all flocked to the conference over the years, and everyone was asking to participate. The conference grew from that workshop of hosting 130 teachers to an annual conference with around 3,000 attendees. By the way, the conference here at ASU has already surpassed that number. Over the years, GAW has had tens of thousands of attendees, ensuring that genocides like the Holocaust, the Armenian, the Assyrian, Bosnian, Rwandan, and the Native American genocides are not forgotten. The Holodomor in the Ukraine has also been part of GAW. Sadly and unfortunately, Russia is again committing atrocities that are clearly against UN Resolution 260A3, Article 2. And as we sit here, 3 of this year's speakers are actively involved in investigating Russian war crimes. 3, Father Dubois, Clint Williams, the Ambassador Clint Williams, and also Ambassador Kukle from Germany, all working on investigating Russian war crimes. Well, eventually GAW was outgrowing its environment, and so before retiring, I met with Doctors Volker Benker and Hava Samuelson and asked if they would be interested in hosting GAW. We spoke and planned over the last 2 years, and in that ensuing long-term conversation, all those conversations, I knew it was the perfect location and it would be in good hands, be sustainable, and grow. Under the auspices of ASU, with partners such as the USHMM, Phoenix Holocaust Association, NAU, U of A, the Armenian and Assyrian communities, to name a few, it just has flourished. This year, we've had 48 presentations, 6 panels, and a major exhibit. Whereas when it was at Scottsdale Community College, I used to have 27. We used to have a couple of exhibits, but I had to have 27 presenters. So it's over doubled in size. So it is the perfect fit. ASU is the new American university. I know I sound like I'm touting ASU, but I am, because ASU has taken this, embraced it with open arms, and it's going to grow. It will take GAW to the highest levels, and not only from the largest conference in North America, but it will become the preeminent genocide conference in the world. On a very personal level, I would like to thank Volker Benkert, Hava Samuelson, Tim Longiel, Cheryl Bronkish, Alex Alvarez, Jason Bruner, Father Zacharias Arbikian, Kim Klett, Barlo Dermugudation, Janice Freebaum, and of course my family, who's been very patient with me over the years and put up with a lot. I'd like to thank them from the bottom of my heart. So with that in mind, we look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's FBI presentation in room 120 in the Coeur Hall, as well as the other presentations here in this room, and also at GAW 11, which, believe it or not, is already in planning stages, and will start on the Monday, the 17th of April in 2023. So thank you very much for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.